Welcome everybody. My name is Phillips and thank you for attending this presentation. I'm from the School of Human Movement Studies. I've been a sport historian in the school for the last 20 years. I've also served as the acting head of the school, as the acting director of the Poach Centre for Indigenous Health. I'm currently the president of the North American Society for Sport History. In line with the theme for this conference, I'm going to talk to you about sport history and social justice. One of the biggest questions in history is, well, what is history? What is it now? And these are questions with answers that I'm not going to resolve in this 15-minute presentation. But I'd like to talk to you about the value of history from my perspective. There are people who argue that there is history for history's sake. That is, we need to know about the ancient Olympic Games because we need to know about the ancient Olympic Games. And I'm not opposed to that position at all. However, over the last couple of decades, the way that I've written my history and conducted my work is with an understanding that biggest and best value for sport history is the way that it can contribute to building strong and resilient communities. That is, empowering those communities in the present and into the future. So I'd like to talk to you about two of those projects. The first one is a history of the Australian Paralympic movement. And the Australian Paralympic movement is the organising body that funds and supports and sends the team to the Paralympic Games held every 4 years, and is also sent to disability sport throughout Australia. The second project is Aboriginal sport history in Australia. So let me firstly start with the Australian Paralympic History Project. It essentially has three components. The first component is a hard copy book. So in that sense, it's very traditional history. But the other two components of this project make it a very atypical history. So the second component is what we will call e-history, which is essentially a historical website. And the third component are the Wikipedia articles that accompany both the book and the e-history. And the three partners for this are School of Human and Nutrition Science, Paralympics Australia, which is the peak body, as I mentioned, and also Wikimedia Australia, which is the Australian dimension of the Wikipedia movement. And we've been funded by the Australian Research Council on a large linkage project that links all those three organisations. So firstly to the book. It's approximately 1,000 words, and as you can see from the chapter outlines there, it covers a range of topics starting from the early days of disability sport prior to the 1960s, right through the Paralympic movement and up to 2018. On the right-hand side there, you can see Australia's two first Paralympic gold medalists, and the photo below is reminiscent of those days when smoking was allowed on aeroplanes. The second part of the project is the e-history, of what we would call a complicated website. And essentially what that is a site that provides a whole host of historical information. And this is the front page, and you can scroll down by decades, and it features our first female Paralympian, Daphne Sini. Or you can scroll through specific games. So the Summer and Paralympic Games have specific tabs, and you can then zone in on the particular games you'd like to follow. And when you open one of those pages, and this is the front page of the Summer Paralympics in 1960, the first games, you can see there's a whole mixture of resources here, stretching from audio-visual material from the oral history collection to video recordings we have of disability athletes, through to teams, full list of teams that are connected to Wikipedia pages, and a whole host of photographs, ephemera that are associated with those games. Or you can actually search by themes. So you can see here a whole range of themes. One of the most interesting, and I guess the most central to the Paralympic movement, is in fact classification and how that's changed over the years. Or you might be interested in media coverage the way in which language is used to depict disability athletes. We may want to know more about the disability groups, which in itself is a complex area, or through to technological developments, because they've been certainly central to the way in which Paralympic sports has developed over the last 5 decades. And our preliminary research shows that this Paralympic Stories, the website, is very popular. And you can see there with the sessions and the bounce rate and the session times. The third and remaining component of the Paralympic History Project is the Wikipedia section. And I remember when we started this project, I just couldn't see how this was going to be a worthwhile part of the project. And those were the days, a decade ago, when we were very critical in academia of Wikipedia. We didn't understand its reach. We didn't understand who could contribute. Or we knew that people could change the articles to anything that they wished to. And of course, a lot of those myths now have been blown away. And Wikipedia is one of the most, or if not the most popular source and site on the web for information collection. And what we've done is create a whole host of articles. In this case, it's Kurt Fearnley, Australia's premier Paralympian. And we've done that for a large range of athletes, a large range of coaches and administrators for specific sports, for games, and so on. It's fairly comprehensive. And we've developed over 1,000 Wikipedia articles. Now, the really interesting thing about this is that we did not predict how popular this would be. So you can see here that we've written over 1,000 articles and they've been viewed up to 14 million times. And the viewing rates are really interesting because they actually vacillate with the Paralympic Games being held in that year. And they also change accordingly between Summer Games and Paralympic Games. And we couldn't have done this project without developing a large community of practice. That is a whole host of volunteers and some people in their professional capacities who are willing to contribute to this project. So we have workshops throughout the country that has included librarians, students, Paralympians, historians, Wikipedians, and those people from memory institutions. We've also been really involved with a range of partners. These partners have been absolutely fundamental to this because their expertise has provided the foundations for the quite a complex project. So the National Library of Australia has a very large oral history collection of Paralympians. The National Film and Sound Archive was central to digitising what was incredibly old films. And the Clearinghouse of Sport was a very important institution for housing the video recordings that we used, many of which were used in the website. And finally, the Research Council was crucial in providing the funding, which without the funding, we could not have done this project. And you can see that not only did they contribute in large sums of money, but there was a lot of in-kind contributions. We tried to measure it in some way to show that not only did were we fortunate to get financial backing, but we were actually very fortunate for the in-kind contributions made by all of these institutions. So as I mentioned, there is 3 components to this project. And some of the central issues that we addressed were ableism. And I'll talk about ableism as I conclude this project. But we use sport as a window into understanding disability in Australia, because looking at the resources, looking at the way in which the Paralympic movement started, the way in which the Paralympic Games were created, was a window into the challenges faced by people with a disability in the Australian context. We're also interested in the legacy of the disability sport. What did it mean when the Games finished? Was there tangible outcomes for the disability community? And finally, was it a sporting sideshow or is the Paralympic Games a facilitator for cultural change? I think that's a really big question, a really important question. And I would argue in the latter that it actually is a very important facilitator of cultural change. So the second project is Aboriginal sport history. And we have worked extensively with the Cherbourg Aboriginal settlement. And this is a settlement in southeast Queensland, formed in the early 1900s, and unfortunately a site of a really tragic part of Queensland and Australia's history in the way in which settler colonial state treated Aboriginal people. And what we've done is use sport as an insight into the way in which Aboriginal people, the Torres Strait Islander people, are forced to live in Australia. The key players in this were not us, but in fact, our Cherbourg history makers, in essence, a group of women who were dedicated to recording their history and telling it in a constructive and formative way. In the bottom right-hand side, you'll see the Ration Shed Museum, which is a central institution at Cherbourg, which is a wonderful museum that depicts the history of Cherbourg, including its sporting history. The four principles we worked with were we needed to be responsible, that is, consult with the Cherbourg community extensively. We need to be respectful and get the Indigenous community involved in the projects. We need to respond to what their needs were. That is, we need to create projects that were relevant for them. And we needed to be reciprocal. That is, whatever work we did needed to go back to the community. So in conjunction with our quite an extensive range of scholarship that has gone with Aboriginal sport history, we've done a whole host of community projects. We've worked with the Play the Ball Museum exhibition in the Ration Shed Museum, Our Sporting Greats, which was held at the State Library of Queensland. We've helped procure small grants for the community. We've organised reunions, as you can see in the bottom photo on the bottom. We're negotiating a documentary, and we've worked extensively with the pre-existing digital history that exists on the Cherbourg site. And sport was central to Cherbourg and Indigenous identity in Queensland and in Australia. You can see there a football match at the top, a football team at the bottom, and then boxing on the bottom right-hand side. And in essence, we thought it was essentially a male story in which the gendered dimensions of life played out in the sporting context. Till one day, one of our elders, Auntie Sandra Morgan, said to us, "Why don't you tell our story?" And we didn't know what story she was talking about. She was talking about the story of the marching girls. Now, not many of us know about marching, but marching for women was a very prominent sport in Australia in the middle of the 20th century. And it extended beyond Australia and New Zealand into other countries. And the young girls from Cherbourg marched, not only in Cherbourg, not only in Brisbane, not only in parts of Queensland, but throughout Australia. And they won a whole series of events at the local, regional, and even national level. And we used the marching girls to understand forms of racism, to understand the government policies about protection and assimilation, to probe into the relationship between sport, gender, and Aboriginality, to look at historical methodologies that worked for Indigenous communities, and to assess the way in which agency, resistance, and strength was used by Aboriginal people through sport. And there are some examples there of the projects that we've worked on. So to conclude, and tying back to the NAK theme about social justice, the kinds of projects that I've been involved in are what I call empowering histories, those that enable us to challenge injustices throughout history. Firstly, the first project, the Paralympic project, helped us to challenge ableism, that is, the stereotyping, the prejudice, the discrimination, social oppression towards people with disabilities. And what the Paralympic project directly addressed was how sport demonstrates and challenges ableism in many ways. The second project, Aboriginal sport history, challenged racial ideologies. And again, this is a complex area, but what the project did was enable us to understand Australia's racist past. we use sport as a way to understand that history. And essentially, we found that sport has a Janus face. It was a form of oppression that racialized athletes who were discriminated against and denied opportunities. And alternatively, sport was a form of resistance that was used by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and their communities to challenge racism and forge individual and collective identities, as well as fostering cultural continuity. Thanks for your attention.